So welcome everyone who has joined us. I really appreciate you coming tonight, and this is very special. We applied for a grant back in November in order to pay and distribute copies of Dark Traffic. It's a book of poetry by Joan Naviyuk Kane. She is Inupiaq and her family, and she grew up in Alaska, and I'll talk a little more about her family and community. And so will she, because we are going to watch a video where she does talk about that and talk about her art, her writing. So just a little background then. Kane is Inupiaq with family from King Island. Actually, would you like to advance to the next slide? Great. Okay, so this shows where on the Alaska map, where you can see where King Island is. That peninsula there has Nome. If you look below, I've highlighted in yellow Nome. And then King Island is in pink, and that's 90 miles northwest of Nome. So let me just read a little more. So she's the author of several collections of poetry and prose. She teaches at Harvard, Tufts, and the Institute of American Indian Arts. She says, "My family lost our ancestral home on King Island after Alaska became the 49th state in 1959. After the people left in 1959, they began to refer to it as Ghost Island. And that was the year that Alaska became a state. It wasn't a forceful removal, but they closed the school. There was a lot of pressure, and that was the era of assimilation policies. So her grandmother and her sisters were among the sole survivors of the 1918 flu pandemic. And because they were orphaned, they were actually raised in a Catholic orphanage under the assimilation policies. And she said about her poems that they are a narrative of sorts about these losses and commemorate what we have retained through language alone. So King Island, she did visit there. I think she made an arrangement, raised funds for 20 people who are Inupiaq with ancestors from King Island to actually go and visit the island. It's not very accessible. It's quite small. You can see that's the picture of the island itself from a distance, but if you look there, that was the settlement. Obviously a very stark environment. The houses there are on stilts. That was the area they were in the winter. They did, the marine hunting there. So I want to go ahead, just let you know what we're going to do tonight. So we're going to start, I'm going to play you a short video of an interview that Kane did, and she talks about just where she comes from as a writer, a poet, and some of what she draws on for her work. And then we're going to watch a reading that she's done of some of her poems. And following that, we'll have breakout sessions, so we can actually book circle, where we can discuss her poetry, how we feel about it, think about it. That's the plan. After the breakout sessions, we'll come back and let's just kind of share what we talked about in our discussions, and we can decide then if we want to watch a little more video of her reciting some of her poems. Okay.
My name is Joan Naviyuk Kane, and I'm a writer, poet, and I'm working on some essays right now. how I first got started as a writer actually comes from outside of writing and outside of the technology of committing words to the page or to the keyboard and then the screen. It comes from my family, my culture as a King Islander, as someone from Oruiba, which is to say it comes from the people in my community. It comes from the language that surrounds me, both in the Inupiaq language, in the King Island dialect of Inupiaq, and also in English, in the language that my mother learned, that people of my mother's generation learned as they were subject to the assimilation era policies of the federal government in the United States. Well, as a Mellon Fellow this year, I think I'm considering issues of race and ethnicity, taking this moment during COVID-19 and taking this moment during a time of reckoning in the United States to really think about the sense of interiority that language, that writing can give me, both in the process of drafting words, of revising words, of thinking about concepts of race and ethnicity, and how until very recently, I feel that my own engagement with issues of identity, of my own race, of my own ethnicity, have been so marginalized. And I'm really taking this opportunity to center questions of indigeneity, of how my visibility as an Indigenous woman, how that carries through, but also thinking about the ways in which Indigenous communities shape and inflect my thoughts, my consciousness, and my intentions when I come to the page. I also think that there's something to be said for really the community of other practitioner fellows this year, and thinking about the ways in which through our really diverse practices, we're able to slow down and take a minute to discuss and talk through how issues of race and ethnicity figure in our work. And in particular, thinking about the ways in which indigeneity and Blackness really figure and are centered and are vital to both our practice and to dismantling the systems of white supremacy that have really, I think, for so long, attempted to dominate and control the narratives and lyrical gestures that we might be making in our art. I think my wish and my hope and my message for the world at this point in my trajectory is that, you know, to do the best we can to seek out the ways in which, considering how experiences, again, have for so long been subsumed, been destabilized, been questioned, been ignored, been rendered invisible. That is to say, the very labor and love of our ancestors, that we remember to carry it with us and to let it guide us, that we're not alone right now, and that to look to art and to look to scholarship about race and ethnicity, to look at the kinds of communities that we can make and build and sustain, how these are really a chance for us to carry through some of the intentions of our ancestors and to make things better for future generations. I think that's one thing that I really hope, is that we can think beyond this moment and to really consider the kinds of privilege we have, but also the kinds of privilege we can build, and privilege not in a negative sense, but really think about the very richness of the world that we have, the kinds of connection we can make with each other.
Okay, great. Let me know if that's working.
Uvlalautok. Wanga Joan Naviyuk, Awiva Mihurunga Sulikaya Mihurunga. Good morning. I'm called for Naviyuk. My family comes from King Island and Mary's Igloo. I'm Joan Naviyuk Kane, and I'm reading today for Poets House from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'll read from Milk Black Carbon, Sublingual, Another Bright Departure, and some new poems too. Savak ang Maya. I opened the door. The fictions of an eternal blue noon, small throws of women in the engine whose green tresses noiselessly tangle into Artemisia Telesi as if bruised underfoot, where he pelts the shadow cast down upon a thin layer of new ice, never dry, Upon a hollow bed of waters run again into the notion of a distant silver cord. I don't advance a step. The mind, too erratic, distracted, is discontinuous at best. Epithalamia. Butane, propane, and lungful of diesel, I did not stand a chance. Always with poison breath, bill, responsibility, a man with rote hands. Everything in exchange, rain in a frozen season, our roofs strung with hot wire, our love, what was, an impression of light, gaunt. There is nothing to get. This poem begins with an epigraph by James Merrill. It is, yes, melting changes the whole picture. The poem's called Dark Traffic, and that's the title of the new collection I'm working on, Dark Traffic. And the snows buffer the sound of a voice set forth. I thought you lost already, that you had gone to neglect the late migration. Before it ceases, the ice collapses easily. There is no day without a symptom. Consolation may turn out to be a guttural practice after all, the small gesture of sound lodged deep before it glides without warning downward. There is nothing but the wind, a howl and dive where water is thrown over water and sown into it. A howl and dive of wind, water I found flown over water where once we found ice, where the snow once stuttered the sound of that shouter shouting for this listener, holding her head in her hands, the head in its fine, blank way, an original. Milk black carbon. Observe the coal dust over boats in the harbor, the snow load on the glacier. Take in the woman who pursues a myth to counter another myth. What dazes, scatters, and filters, each respiration blurs an image. The coal tipple tilts in its blue skin, meadows blonde. From open shelves, honey jars tumble to split and spill in the gasp of a tumbler. The thick odor of a nearby smoke will signal the end of something not summer. The fire veins as sap does, translating stands of beetle-killed spruce to crackle and torch. She cannot hurt too much too long. Take in the woman you have not become, and then take a little breath and hold your breathing. Breathe. Don't move, and hold your breath again. Rookeries. All men knew a secret of the northern part of an old world, a less perfect idea. For the bicornuate woman, it is an island. If there the birds lose our trust, we might learn their language. After all, we have been taught to read and write, to remove our hands from other work as we watch water twist into rock, to cover our wounds, staying alive, light after light. For something I worry. The moon pronounced with clarity its known topography. Our letters and lists reconstructed grammars. They replaced the ways in which we were grabbed, then pushed and shoved. A fine wife and her children set to rove with indefinite orders. Lineal migration on the small scale. The purpose was not nautical, but conflictual. Of those men we knew I could never do them any good. In this way I forget and let the wind river. It gales and tears at my shoulders and wrists.
I am going to set up breakout rooms now, and I'm going to assign them randomly. I think we'll break this into 3 groups, and we'll stay in there 15 minutes and then return so we can share our thoughts. So I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion. If you wouldn't mind unmuting, I'd like to kind of hear a little bit about what you discussed in the breakout rooms.
Our group had a really nice discussion. We were all over the place, but I think we touched on a lot of things that, you know, we had someone in our group who knew more about poetry than I did, because it's just something I don't know much about. And so I had not thought to read the poems out to myself and was just kind of reading them in my head. And I think they're definitely more impactful read out. So it was nice to hear the poet herself read them out as well. I'll be looking up her YouTube videos for sure. So, but yeah, we talked about just the colorful vocabulary throughout that sometimes I needed a thesaurus to refer to for certain words. And that was part of the fun, I think, is like, what does this all mean? Trying to decipher it. So, and a lot of themes about femininity intertwined with climate change and, you know, ancestry and the kind of harsh landscape in Alaska and how that's changed is kind of what I was left with the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked a little bit about the oration as well, and we were coming up with some similar ideas that we liked. Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. But some of us had said that we really didn't listen to the poets reading their work. And I sort of find a lyricism to it. Sometimes I like to even listen to some older poets. The other one I was thinking about was Ideas of Order in Key West by Wallace Stevens, that sort of had imagery of the sea and the woman in the sea and being engulfed by what she was experiencing. And then April was talking about Dean Young, which is an author I'm not familiar with, but I want to take a look at that. But we had a really delightful conversation. And then we were ripped out of the room.
Well, this can be a delightful conversation.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So I think, does anyone else have anything else to add? April, maybe?
Jen and I were, so Jen brought up the concept of audiobooks or listening to books on tape in general versus poetry being read out loud. And I just thought that that was a very interesting comparison because it's such a different experience. And I had never thought of it that way. But I also realized it's completely why I've never sought out listening to poetry out loud, because I hate books on tape. But it turns out I love listening to poetry. This is the first time I've done it. So I just thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, I have to say that none of us thought about even looking up poets and their reading of their own poetry.
We also kind of talked about like her use of like space and like not letters, but like other visual elements within her poem.
Yeah, the parentheses and the other punctuations that she utilized in a very unique way to convey a lot more with the dialogue.
Crossed out words, the little circle things with the X's in it that she used all over the place.
I think as well, it was helpful, Kelly, to have the photos at the beginning showing the geographic location. That was another thing I kind of wished I had taken the time to look up, because there were a lot of geographic references, like in the White Alice Gone to Hell poems, that I found. Some of them were Air Force bases, some of them I couldn't quite tell if they were airport codes. And so I think that there's definitely more to the story than I'm getting, and I would like to hear more by the poet kind of explaining the context around some of those locations. And you know, I think one of them is a correctional center, the AVM Anvil Mountain, and then, you know, there's Cold Bay, Anchorage, Diamond Ridge. So that's definitely something that I plan on looking up.
Well, there definitely seems to be a reverence in Native American culture to location and place, and you know, that's sort of been stolen from them in a way. If we look at things from a post-colonial perspective, you know, so maybe there's something there with looking at those locations, Sabrina. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's true. And I think locations that have been co-opted into different names now is an interesting thing too, because clearly, I mean, Anchorage wasn't always Anchorage, and Fairbanks wasn't always Fairbanks, and so I think maybe it might be a reclamation of that in some ways.
Yeah,
Another
even then
interesting-
that discussion we had just recently, Sabrina, as well, sort of talking about how even their own name was taken away from them, you know, and given a westernized form. So their identity is almost in crisis. So yeah, I think that there's some of that there as well. You know, we were talking about even metadata, you know, is biased in its own way. So it's really a lot to think about here.
Another interesting thing, kind of that I found, I was looking up some sources for something for work at my library, based on something I learned in one of my classes. And I found an article that talked about there's a library in, I believe it's in British Columbia, but I'm not entirely sure. And it's like the Native American section of that library, like it's specifically like run by Native Americans or Native, yeah. And then, but the way that they organize their books is based on Native American cataloging rather than the cataloging of that we use. And the way that they cataloged it was by place. So I found that very interesting.
That is interesting. Thank you.
I haven't heard of that library specifically, but I've heard of the concept of not just with Native American cultures, but other cultures in general, although with a general emphasis on Native American cultures, redoing the cataloging, particularly with subject headings, to incorporate more culturally accurate subject headings. And also just in general, moving away from the Dewey Decimal System, because the Dewey Decimal System is so Eurocentric. So I will definitely look up that library. Hopefully I can find it based on that.
Yeah, Avril, that's exactly what Michelle was kind of talking about. We were at an event last night with the Student Archivist Association. It was with the Labriola Center at ASU. And we were discussing reparative description, and kind of the speaker highlighted exactly Library of Congress subject headings and how oftentimes they do not align with how they call themselves, and it's not Indigenous centered language, and kind of how we can change that going forward. And it's a lot of work, and it's unfortunately for now it just kind of necessitates coping with what's worked in the past, and having he mentioned it's like being re-traumatized every time you see the headings that are ascribed to images with Native people in it. So it was very interesting. It was a great talk.
Yes, I just want to add that Irene, that is what originally started me reading about that. So thank you for linking that.
A friend of mine was just up in Vancouver, Canada, and had gone to the Anthropology Museum at University of Vancouver or something. And she was saying they have this really stunning collection that's, the best. It covers the, the West Coast and then kind of around the Pacific Rim. And she was saying that there actually wasn't a lot of labeling or descriptions of the items in the museum. And I don't know for sure why they did that, but it kind of reminded me of this, which is why I looked it up today, was, when we have all these descriptions in these museums in regards to anthropological items, it's so damaging, like I forget who said it, but it's re-traumatizing, because a lot of times the item is given an ownership label that is not from the people who made it. It's from the person who, inherited it or took it or bought it. And so I just, I'm curious how museums and obviously libraries handle that. I think it's a project that a lot of us need to work on moving forward.
I put the link for that
Oh, thanks.
center I was talking about in the chat.
It makes sense to me that those kinds of labels would be re-traumatizing, especially based on place names. Like a state park in California, one of my favorite state parks, was recently renamed, or they didn't call it rename it, they called it restoring its name. So they restored its name based on what the Indigenous people have always called it. And so I looked up what it was originally, this is getting complicated, what the state parks had been calling it. And it turns out that it was based on a white man who had murdered an Indigenous child. And so, you know, it makes perfect sense to me that looking at these names that are oftentimes based on white people who murdered, you know, of course we need to redo subject headings. Why would we want subject headings that are oftentimes based on murder and genocide and other horrible events?
Definitely, Avril. Great point.
Yeah, this
So-
appropriation, you know, you come in, you name something as yours. There's her ancestors are from King Island. And the settlement that they went to after leaving King Island is called Mary's Igloo. In Australia, you know, the most famous landmark there, natural landmark, is Uluru, but that's only recently that it has restored its name from the Indigenous culture. It's, you know, been known for, I don't know how many, over 100 years as Ayers Rock. You know, this belongs to me. I came into here and this now belongs to me. I've taken this.
So the project I was actually working on when I was researching that particular with that particular library is one of my classes we learned about Debbie Reese and her work with the children's literature in Native American children's literature, and I'm actually working with my library right now to see if we can move all of the children's or all of the Native American stories that are labeled as fables, fairy tales, and folklore to the religious section, because a lot of them are religious stories, but they're not in the religious section.
That sounds awesome. What library are you at?
Well, it's still in the beginning stages, and I'm the one who's bringing it about because I'm putting a big emphasis on it. But I'm at the Davis County Library in Utah. But it's something that she mentioned in one of the videos that we watched for my children's literature class, or my children's materials or something like that. And I decided that I was like, well, this is something that we should probably do in our library. So I've kind of got the gears rolling on how to make that happen.
Yeah, that's how stuff gets started.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We've talked about, you know, cataloging and subject headings. Another place that I've come across issues about this is in copyright issues. You know, I don't, if you're familiar with copyright, you know, there's the Creative Commons licensing system for different licenses, and I have been the managing editor of Archaeota. It's the SAA student chapter publication. So every issue I'm using, you know, dozens of digital images, and I have to, you know, be careful about digital copyright. One last issue from January is someone wrote an article about the Hula Preservation Society. He's Native Hawaiian. And I wanted to be respectful. I just don't want to go out there and grab copyright free, you know, public domain or images, because that's very dominant culture oriented? Do I have, the right to publish this image that, so learning about this society and learning more about the Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian preservation of their cultural heritage, they actually have their own licensing system, which is wonderful. It's called the Traditional Knowledge label. So I was able to use images because they had the Traditional Knowledge non-commercial label. So our use of them was within that framework. So just knowing about things like that. In Australia, this comes up because the idea of making an image of someone from these indigenous cultures, that's like, it's so taboo. It's against, it's like stealing an image, and then all of these images are then in archives, and then they're made available. And that's something that they've had to really engage in, just to how they can be respectful of the culture, because otherwise they're, all these images are just published and used in ways that aren't appropriate culturally.
That reminds me of, so I feel like when I was a kid and I went into museum exhibits, I would never see signs saying, don't photograph this for cultural reasons. It was just, for lighting, preservation, whatever. But recently now, when I go into museums, I will sometimes see a sign saying that, the tribe has requested that you not photograph this, and they monitor it, which I think is really fantastic.
I'm going to paste into chat the link to the Archeota publication. It's published on SJSU ScholarWorks. And like I said, the last issue, we had someone write, a Native Hawaiian, write about his culture and his work as an intern with the Hula Preservation Society. So I'm just going to share that with everyone.
I had a feeling it might have been Marcus. He's on SLA, so I was like, oh,
yes, it is.
yes.
It is Marcus.
I was like, I think it's probably Marcus. He's the only Native Hawaiian I've come across in San Jose so far. So that's exciting for him. I'm glad.
Yeah, it was a wonderful article. Has anyone ever else come, in their actual work or an internship, had to deal with any of these issues?
So an interesting thing that I came across in the beginning of a course this semester, we started with land dedications. And so I'm in LA County, and I was curious and I looked it up, and in the process of doing that research, discovered that, there's a lot of places that are named after some of the indigenous cultures here, like Topanga and Malibu and places like that. But then there are also a lot of places that are named after the missionaries. So we've got like the Gabrielino Trail that starts in like, the Hahamonga Watershed Park, and Gabrielino is named after the missionaries, whereas Hahamonga is named after the native tribes that were here. And I found that was really interesting, that you don't necessarily know, the names are historical, but you don't know like, from what part of history are they from.
Anna, so many places in LA are also named after like the area of California when Spain was here and giving away all those giant land grants, like,
Yes.
Dominguez. And
Yes.
so fascinating to get
Yeah.
into.
That's all tied into the missionary culture, which, the kids all study in elementary school. They learn all about the missions, and that's what I learned growing up too. And then there's this whole other aspect of it where it wasn't taught before.
Yeah, but isn't it amazing to look at like that land grant system and be like, oh, we are all our names are still.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you said, the naming system is very, very ingrained. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because she talks about language and how, she uses English too, but it's layered with, the languages from her own culture. And yeah, I just think that I'm going to go back, and I'm sure we all will, and go back to her book and just, I think I could read each poem 10 times and, still be trying to, gain more from it. And someone said earlier about, there's the idea, reading poems out loud, it's an audiobook, and yet it's so very, very different. When I put this together, it's actually looking, if you do go on, look it up, you can find the poets reading their own poetry, and it's an entirely different experience. It's not just, someone reading into a microphone for the text of an audiobook.
Yeah, Jen and I were saying there were a couple poems in here that we were going to specifically try and find audio for, like White Alice on page 13, to see how that one was read out, since it has the struck through text or struck out text.
Yeah, I in that document, I wrote down, I typed up the poems that she recited in that video, and put the page numbers in the book. And the first two were from different, two other collections that she has. But yeah, I didn't find her reciting all of them, though, there might be gems hidden somewhere. One thing that I found too was like a panel presentation or just discussion of different writers, Indigenous and Black, and just, from so-called marginalized groups, and just their take on this. One was on, the environment in their writing and in the concepts of their writing. So there's just so much, and it all ties together. I think I'll make sure I put that link in that document too, because that was a really interesting one. Obviously, so much of what she writes is, there's the environment, it saturates all of her poetry. So kind of seeing her, take on that was interesting. Avril, I just wanted to, do you want to say something about Goodreads? Because
yes, for sure. Okay, so it's in the document as well, but I'll link it here too. So we have set up an asynchronous book circle to continue this, add more at any point. So you can reply to the current thread. You can make a new one, make a new topic. There's kind of, depending on whether you've got something really specific or not, if you want a new topic, if you've got something really specific, make a new thread altogether, or if you just have general things, however you want to work it. But basically you can just go ahead and start replying. And if there's anything that you think of later, just go ahead and put it up there. It's asynchronous, like our program, and just, continue the conversation there.
yeah, I haven't used Goodreads like that, so I'm going to challenge myself to do that. I think that would be, has anyone else actually done anything like that on Goodreads?
Not that specifically, but I am a Goodreads fanatic, so I would love to interact more with groups, because I mostly just do it solo stuff. So
and I will put out there that I set the Goodreads group to be for San Jose State students only, because I thought that would be the best way for us to all interact. If anyone has literally any trouble with that, you can send a message to our Facebook and I will personally help you out with that. And I'm just going to, okay, we've got the screen sharing, cool. So
Oh, cool.
there's the direct link to the group, but also if you just go to our Goodreads page, then it's right here. And you can just reply right here. Or if you want to start a new discussion, you can just go to discussions and you can start a new topic about this book or any other for that matter. And there's different folders. So if you're doing it about like this one, you can put in the book giveaway, or if you're doing it about something else, stick it in another folder. It is really straightforward. So if you have ever managed to do discussion board on campus, I am confident we can all manage here.
The other thing that I will be doing, in order to support this program, we applied for a grant, got a grant for $1,500 from SJSU, and this is how we supported the giveaway. So we were able to purchase 65 copies of Dark Traffic with that. So we are past the hour. I've loved this discussion. I wanted to say that, yes, I'll be posting the video, but we report back to the grantor. So, we applied for a grant, and it was, for the purpose of honoring diverse voices, but just developing our own competencies as LIS professionals. So I will create a reflections video, and I will include some of our reflections in that, and I will be reaching out to you again. I may have some questions. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I've enjoyed the discussion so much. Learning about her poetry and, performing it and talking about it, and all the other conversations she's had with other writers. For me, the research was a really rewarding experience. And I hope you've enjoyed this whole process too.
Thank you so much, Kelly. This was wonderful.
Definitely, Kelly. And thanks for getting the book giveaway all together.
So great. All right, everybody. Good night, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks, everybody. This was awesome.